Okay, I will start. My name is Gary Porter. I'm a member of Socialist Action for, I don't know, how long, Barry? 5 years or so? And the LSA before that. Anyway, I've been a Trotskyist of one sort or another for many years. And I've read and presented on many, many subjects. So tonight we're talking about the materialist dialectic. So it's not dialectical materialism. That would be a discussion of materialism, and particularly one form of it, the dialectical materialism. This is a discussion of dialectic, and one form of the dialectic, the materialist dialectic. So Hegel wrote a book called Logic, which was about idealist dialectics. It was about dialectics of the mind, of ways of thinking, and so on. And so he was discussing free will and the existence of God and those sorts of things. And Marxists, properly speaking, don't believe in free will, but we believe in the recognition of necessity as the only basis for freedom. So our concept of dialectics is dialectics out of nature. So we don't look at the abstract world. We look at nature, and then we try to draw inferences out of nature to see how nature really functions. And out of that comes our understanding of dialectics, because that's the way, in our view, nature operates. So let me step back a second and say that this extract, which was pre-circulated, and I hope all of you have read it, written by Leon Trotsky and published in December of 1939, 8 months before he was murdered, was a contribution to the discussion in the Socialist Workers Party, was an extract from his contribution to Petty-Bourgeois Opposition in the SWP. That was a discussion that arose out of many things, but it was precipitated by the Stalin-Hitler Pact, in which they agreed not to attack each other for 10 years. Of course, Hitler didn't wait that long. This was in 1939. He attacked Russia on June 22nd of 1941, thus breaking the agreement, which of course he broke all agreements, but was an effort by Stalin to stave off the attack, which he knew was coming from Hitler sooner or later. So it was his effort to do that. Now, that shocked everybody, that agreement, because it the last thing anybody expected was an agreement between Stalin's Russia and Stalin's Soviet Union and fascist Germany. It kind of made Russia look to many as an ally of the fascists, and really played a massive role in undercutting support for the Soviet Union among workers in the workers' movement. So part of this discussion, important part of this discussion, was that James Burnham, a university professor, and Max Shachtman, a longtime Trotskyist, started to attack the notion that the Soviet Union should be unconditionally defended against imperialism, whether that was any form of imperialism. And of course, the one that was most likely was going to be Germany, fascist imperialism. And so they began to quake in their boots at that thought that they would be asked to support this, and then somehow among their friends defend the notion that they were defending the Soviet Union that signed an agreement with Hitler. So it became a big discussion on how we analyze things. How did we come to the conclusion that we supported the unconditional defense of the Soviet Union? And we were prepared to face up to whatever that meant, because that was the right position based on our analysis of the nature of the Soviet state, the nature of the bureaucratic encrustment that was at the head of the Soviet state. And Trotsky had made that analysis and was set out prominently in, most prominently, in The Revolution Betrayed, a book by Trotsky in which he explained the changed nature of the leadership of the Soviet Union, analyzed what that was, what kind of a social phenomenon that bureaucratic layer was, and what it meant, how now Russia needed to have, the Soviet Union needed a political revolution, but not a social revolution. It was still based on public ownership of the means of production. It was and central planning and that sort of thing. So the major gains of the Russian Revolution in October of 1917 had been sustained up to that point, and therefore the nature of the revolution that was needed, the overthrow that was needed, was simply an overthrow of the political encrustment in the Soviet Union. So that's the background. Trotsky participated in that discussion a lot, and this is an excerpt from one of his documents. So he's trying to explain what dialectics is, because Burnham and Shachtman said that he agreed with dialectics, but that his disagreement with Burnham didn't. Burnham thought it was kind of Druid nonsense. It was thesis, antithesis, synthesis, kind of formulaic, and had held little relation to the real world. Burnham was caught up in pragmatism and the Americans' crude version of it, common sense. And of course, pragmatism was simply a watered-down version of British empiricism. All of these were based on the formal logic, which had been set out by Aristotle back in ancient Greek philosophic days. The Aristotelian syllogism. A is A was the fundamental axiom of Aristotle. They start this. These are axioms, and so Aristotle's three axioms, where A is A and non-A are not the same, and something cannot be both A and non-A. So he excluded the coexistence of opposites, and that was perfectly wrong. So Heraclitus, long before, Heraclitus was in the philosophers we study mostly are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Plato was a student of Socrates, and Aristotle was a student of Plato. So those were three different generations, one right after the other. And not long before that, there were two other major, well, three really, but there were two that I'm thinking of. One was Heraclitus, who was in Ephesus, where, for those people who are former Christians, where John is supposed to have been when he wrote the Gospel according to John, and he was also supposed to be looking after the mother of Jesus in Ephesus in Asia Minor. And so that was a colony at this point. It was a Greek colony, but it was a colony under the Babylonian Empire. So, or the Persian Empire, actually. Heraclitus was known as a grumpy guy who did not get along well with others, and left Ephesus and went up in the mountains to live, because he found that he did not suffer fools gladly, and he found far too many fools in Ephesus. So he lived around the same time as Pythagoras, and many of us know of the Pythagorean theorem. So these are both pre-Socratic philosophers. Heraclitus came up with the notion that all things changed except for change. We would add that change itself changes. That is to say, the nature of change changes over time. But at least he came to the point where everything changes except for the fact that things change. So he also said, we know the famous expression that you can't step into the same river twice. Now, if you go a little further, what he said was, because it's not the same river and it's not the same you. a person steps into the river and then steps back in. It's not the same river. It's not the same person. That's because everything is constantly changing. The silt in the bottom of the river changes, the water flowing over the silt changes, the life and the fish have all moved and changed. Some have been born. You yourself are busy changing all the time. He points out that you can for practical short-term purposes you can say, yeah, okay, but for practical purposes, I am the same person. I am stepping in the same river. But for anything more than simple analysis, you have to take the change into account. So he also said that contradiction coexists, that opposites coexist. So he's completely denying what Aristotle later would say, which was that you can't be both A and non-A. You can't have opposites within the same entity. And for us, opposites in the same entity is the rule more than the exception. For example, we take a look at the NDP and we say, well, this is a workers' party, but it's run by a petty bourgeois leadership, which is supporting capitalism as opposed to the workers' agenda. So that's a contradiction, and will have to be resolved someday. But also, the working class coexists with the capitalist class in capitalism, because the capitalist system cannot exist without workers. It's the only source of profit, the only source of value is the working class. So it's impossible to conceive of capitalism without a working class. On the other hand, if workers take power, which would be the resolution of the thesis and the antithesis, the capitalists and the working class, if workers take power, they don't need the capitalists. The capitalists are unnecessary. You can have centralized public ownership and centralized planning using workers' democracy both at all levels, from factory to the national government or to the international government, as a matter of fact. And you don't need any capitalist class. In other words, the capitalists, once they do their job of developing mercantile capitalism and then industrial capitalism and then imperialism, once they've accomplished that, which they had accomplished by the beginning of World War I, they are unnecessary. They don't perform any useful function. We see this in the present the financialization of the economy, which is completely useless. It's all economic rents based on ownership of financial assets and of real estate, and is a completely unnecessary and completely blood-sucking function that only holds back the development of the real economy and the living standards of the working people. So that's another example of opposites actually do coexist, and and play an explosive role. Now, one of the things that Burnham, Shachtman saw dialectics. Oh yeah, he said he said, I agree with dialectics and Burnham doesn't, but it doesn't matter in real life. So he didn't really understand dialectics at all, because it's absolutely crucial. You don't understand the evolution of human society and the evolution of the struggle of the working class against the ruling class unless you actually not only know, but can apply dialectics in the form of analysis concretely of the real world and a decision about where the contradictions are and how to apply leverage to assist in the evolution of the struggle so that it blows up into a revolution. Shachtman he looked at it as kind of a general progress, that he had denuded dialectics of one of its key elements, which is the revolutionary transformation from quantity to quality, which is always a burst, like a birth. Birth is always messy, and in nature as well as in society, and they had denuded it of, even the dialecticians who were abstract petty bourgeois kinds of dialecticians were stripping dialectics of its real revolutionary nature. So let me just say a couple things about the nature of dialectics. Um, dialectics, Trotsky goes at some length of describing the notion of that. He says A is A, and for practical purposes on a day-to-day basis, we can work with that as long as the time is limited and the scope is limited, and our purpose is time limited. Uh, but but dialectics is to formal logic or Aristotelian logic as well. He uses the example of lower simple mathematics compared to advanced mathematics. Another example might be Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics when we discuss gravity, where Newton says that gravity, the force of gravity, is between two masses. It's a force of attraction between two masses, which is a relationship between, it increases with the increased mass of each of the objects, and decreases or is proportionally reduced by the square of the different distance between the two. So it has to do with size of mass and distance between the two. And then that's his formula. And that's true within limits. But Einstein says, no, gravity isn't that. First of all, he introduced the concept of space-time as one thing, that there's four dimensions, height, length, and width, but also time, and that is another dimension. And so you have space-time. And gravity is how space-time guides masses, objects, mass objects, and how they move. So that's way more dynamic, way more fluid, and so basically, if you put a bowling ball on a rubber sheet, you'll see the bowling ball depresses the sheet. If you put if you take a marble and spin it around the hole, it'll move. It'll move in an orbit around the bowling ball. Now it's going to go to the bottom because it's within other gravities, like the gravity of the Earth pulling the marble towards the center of the Earth. But if it was out in space, it would go around the bowling ball more or less continuously. So he's talking about the interpenetration of space-time and the weight of the objects and so on. It incorporates the notions of Newton, but it's more complicated. And it also means that gravity is limited by the speed of light, which Newton didn't realize. Anyway, I'm not going to go too far into that because I don't understand it all that well. Dialectics is a form of logic. When I studied logic at the University of Carleton University, I was very good at formal logic. That's the kind of logic we were taught. And I remember writing an exam with 200 participants, and I stood first. So I'm very good at Aristotle. With all the syllogisms, the Venn diagrams, and all that stuff. And I've never been able to test myself in terms of my understanding of dialectics. But I'm hoping you're getting a sense of the difference. So it's like the relationship between Newtonian physics and Einstein. It's like the difference between, another thing is between arithmetic and calculus would be another example, a very good example of the difference between the two forms of logic. So logic is a way we think. It's a form of how we have a systematic approach to how we analyze things and how we draw conclusions and inferences. And it's just a more advanced systematic way of doing it. And it's impossible to understand the dynamics of social revolution and social change without understanding dialectics. And I'm going to stop there. I'm done.
Right on. If
I
I
am
can
done.
pick up, okay, are you done? Come on.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll pick up here, I guess. Thank you for that. Very interesting. I'm going to take a little different direction. You did a lot of historical applications, which is cool. Am I able to? I'm going to try sharing my screen. I just want to read over because it's a really short text. Um, and it's just chock full of like really excellent, poignant sentences and illustrations and stuff about material dialectics. So I think it's worth our while to just kind of review together some of the statements and we can go through kind of what they mean. Where is my materials dialectics? There we go. And can everybody see the text?
Yep.
Okay. So
Can
let's
you expand that so it's a little easier to read?
um it's I can try to zoom in a bit, but do try to make sure your zoom is open, is maximized, because sometimes when it's not fully opened up,
Oh,
then
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
okay. So the A is equal to A. I just want to go over some kind of like fundamental, at least takeaways of the philosophy that I understand it and how to just kind of get a common understanding, clear understanding of the contrast that Trotsky's making here between, what Gary was talking about, the kind of more idealist uh, logic and abstracted ways of thinking, which does come from Aristotle for sure. In terms of, that Aristotelian logic is really what took hold in the medieval ages. Um, that was one of the things that did manage to kind of survive, I suppose, the medieval ages until there was a larger Greco-Arabic translation movement that kind of ended up translating a lot of the Greek philosophical texts, but that was later into the, I think, 16th century, 15th century, and kind of kicked off some of the Renaissance, they say. But in any case, Aristotelian logic is generally associated with uh, ends and like and where you ends in themselves, where you the end you start with the end. So it's a lot of and then you kind of work your way back to that end. So it starts with a lot of universal kind of immutable statements and concepts. And as we'll see, that's not really the logic of dialectics, which is based, as Gary was saying, on a more Hegelian understanding. But as he correctly pointed out, Hegel stays in idealism, in abstraction, and what Hegel doesn't do, which what Trotsky and dialecticians, Lenin, Marx advocate doing, is uh, bringing that analysis into the real world by examining how it would um, progress or exist over time and space and how it might change over time and space and whether the character and the context and the conditions that it's experiencing, how that changes it through time and space. So let's start with A is equal to A. So he says, I'll attempt here to sketch the substance of a problem in a very concrete form. The Aristotelian logic of simple syllogism starts from the proposition that A is equal to A. This postulate is accepted as an axiom for a multitude of practical human actions and elementary generalizations. But in reality, A is not equal to A. This is easy to prove if we observe these two letters under a lens. They are quite different from each other. But one can object the question is not of size or form of letters, since they are only symbols for equal quantities. For instance, a pound of sugar. The objection is beside the point. In reality, a pound of sugar is never equal to a pound of sugar. A more delicate scale always discloses a difference. Again, one can object that a pound of sugar is equal to itself. Neither is this true. All bodies change uninterruptedly in size, weight, and color, etc. They are never equal to themselves. A sophist will respond that a pound of sugar is equal to itself at any given moment. Aside from the extremely dubious practical value of this axiom, it does not withstand theoretical criticism either. How should we really conceive of the word moment? If it is an infinitesimal interval of time, then a pound of sugar is subjected during the course of that moment to inevitable changes. Or is the moment purely a mathematical abstraction? That is, a zero of time. But everything exists in time, and existence itself is an uninterrupted process of transformation. Time is consequently a fundamental element of existence. Thus, the axiom A is equal to A signifies that a thing is equal to itself if it does not change, that is, if it does not exist. So, what I find striking here, yeah, he's just so like matter of fact about it. Um, Gary, I'm gonna mute you just because I hear you laughing, but I appreciate that. Wait, I can't mute you. I'm not a host right now. But yeah, so when I read this, it's got some certainly some similarities to some Buddhist philosophy, actually, on dependent origination, and just the concept of everything constantly being changing, which is also found in pre-Socratic, philosophy. And there is a scholarship that exists that, examines the similarities and potential historical kind of, sharing of intellectual legacy between that and stuff as well. But it's kind of interesting because once you can recognize what dialectical thinking is, you can recognize it in a lot of different sort of fields of inquiry, versus idealist or just formally abstracted thinking. Um, and dialectical thinking is about historicizing, is about contextualizing, is about there's a phrase that Trotsky uses down here somewhere, but about like seeking the origination of something and then seeking to understand how it changes um, over time and space. So to that end, dialectical thinking can be destabilizing, right? It's like deconstructing. It is it's counterposed to concepts of immutability, of eternality, of things being a fixed abstraction. Trotsky does refer many times to fixed abstractions, um, and how, the moment, like a moment in time, right? A moment in time is an abstraction that doesn't actually exist in our experiential life. We don't experience a moment. We only experience time, going by. But a moment, a zero of time, is a logical abstraction that helps us reason, right? It's more of a reflection of our critical and reasoning faculties than necessarily the world. Um, but much, like math, these logical formal abstractions uh, help us and guide us, and they literally form the framework of how of our rationality and of our reasoning. But they in themselves, these abstractions, math, like think about math for an instance, they're in themselves, they don't reflect the reality of the world, which, as we know, must include time and space, right? Another way to think of it, I think, is entropy. If anyone's kind of familiar with that term, basically like the randomness, but also just the fact that, on a chemical molecular level, things are always changing. We are, as soon as we're born, we start dying, that kind of thing. Like things are always in flux. We're in reality always subject to the material conditions, degradation, growth, development, changing uh, material reality. And, we don't exist in any kind of an abstraction that is not subject to time and space. Um, and in terms of common sense and dialectical thinking, I want to read over this paragraph because I think it's such a good illustration, and it's a bit of what we were talking about before. Dialectical thinking is related to vulgar in the same way that a motion picture is related to a still photograph. The motion picture does not outlaw the still photograph, but combines a series of them according to the laws of motion. Dialectics does not deny the syllogism, but teaches us to combine syllogisms in such a way as to bring our understanding closer to the eternally changing reality. Hegel, in his logic, established a series of laws: change of quantity into quality, development through contradictions, conflict of content and form, interruption of continuity, change of possibility into inevitability, etc., which are just as important for theoretical thought as is the simple syllogism for more elementary tasks. So, common sense, vulgar logic is the way he puts it, or otherwise kind of abstracted or thinking that's based on kind of fixed, immutable concepts, um, is like a photograph. It's not exactly not true, but it's not telling the whole story, right? And it's not providing us a meaningful reflection of the dynamics of the real world, like a video would. Um, and on the quantitative and to qualitative uh, dichotomy, I guess you could put it that way. Um, it's, I think, a very important concept. And especially when you think of, okay, what is it in contrast to, right? So it would be in contrast, the idea that the number of something, the quantity of something, can change to a certain extent that it begins affecting the quality of something, the nature, the character of something, um, can be counterposed to a philosophy where everything is discrete, where everything has its own limitations, everything is its um, own, individual category, and where things, are, whether they're concepts or material items, like they they're immutable. They already have existence. Whereas dialectical materialism and understanding that qualities and properties arise out of, a certain configuration of material components, uh, doesn't kind of cleave things apart in such a straightforward black and white way, as what abstractions would do. So in information systems theory, in different, philosophies, this has been called theories of emergence, and we can see it. It's actually kind of gaining more steam recently through like quantum quantum mechanics theories and other like um, biological systems as well. So I can go through some kind of illustrations as like what does it mean when something is qualitatively changed just through the quantity of it changing. Um, let's say, so an example of this that has been used in emergence theory, we can look at the molecule of water. So when we look, when we just look at a hydrogen atom, then we look at an oxygen atom, and then there's another oxygen atom. Each of these uh, have different properties. They act different ways, based on their material configuration with the neutrons, etc. But when these components join up in a certain configuration to be, H2O, the property of wetness now becomes a thing. Separate hydrogen and oxygen, atoms, molecules, do not have the property of wetness. That's an emergent property and character of that particular configuration. And something that's, the way that kind of fits in with dialectics in general, and something that's important to remember is that dialectics is not just a contradiction, right? Like that's part of it. But I think sometimes people forget about the sort of the synthesis aspect in a dialectic. It's not just A and B, where a little bit of A goes into B and then a little bit of B goes into A. That certainly does happen. Um, but it's also that through the process of, the flipping and the going between each other or combining and uncombining, n new phenomena arises. So as Gary is saying, you may step into a river twice, but you will never be the same person and it won't be the same river. He goes along, all bodies change uninterruptedly in size, weight, and color. Okay, I already read that part. Um, yeah, and it's important to remember as well, when a quantitative changes in A are negligible for the task at hand, then we can presume that A is equal to A. So just a note on what he talks about there in terms of tolerance. He has this idea that A is equal to A, or, a pound of sugar is equal to a pound of sugar um, to a certain degree. But once that pound of sugar, something happens to it, or there's too much of it where it's significant for the task at hand, um, then something, then that pound of sugar is not, it doesn't have the same function as what it did before. So I'll read out a bit of read a bit more of what he was saying on that. So when quantitative changes in A are negligible for the task at hand, then we can presume that A is equal to A. This is, for example, the manner in which a buyer and seller consider a pound of sugar. We consider the temperament of the sun likewise. Until recently, we consider the buying power of the dollar in the same way. But quantitative changes beyond certain limits become converted into qualitative. A pound of sugar subjected to the action of water or kerosene ceases to be a pound of sugar. A dollar in the embrace of a president ceases to be a dollar. To determine at the right moment that critical point where quantity changes into quality is one of the most important and difficult tasks in the spheres of knowledge, including sociology. When the quantity of something changes to such an extent that the quality is different, I mean, to me, that means that what we should be assessing, if we're wanting to be looking out for that moment when there is a qualitative change, it means that we should be assessing things by their function, by their impact, by the relationship that they have with the real world, rather than, let's say, a preoccupation with the nominal form, with the name, with the category, with the legacy of something, because we're understanding through dialectical materialism that everything changes through time and space, and there are no fixed immutable eternals. Then it has to follow that nothing remains the same, even if they're referred to in a similar manner, and that we need to assess the function and the relationship of forces to assess the character of something, because we're not going to figure out the actual qualitative character of something just by looking at the name or assuming that what is being referred to in that category is immutable and not changing. So when something's changed, it's acquired a different impact on the world and it has a different property. I mean, I didn't actually think that Trotsky's examples there were super good. I mean, there were examples, but in terms of something taking on a new qualitative property because the quantity has changed, I think we can think of a bit better examples because like a pound of sugar being subjected to water. I get what he's saying, but that's not really a quantitative difference. That is a material difference to the context and the conditions, which obviously changes the property of sugar there. But something like, I don't know if you guys have heard in toxicology, the dose makes the poison. Could be a good example. You may be taking the same quantity of something, but at one point it can go at the right dose, it's a medicine, right? At the wrong dose, it's a poison. So the nature and the impact of that obviously changes. Um, Mob mentality, I thought was also a good example, where there's a sort of and people have explained the phenomena this way, right? It's not the same thing as like just a bunch of individual people going mad or getting crazy or having their own individual gripes. It's like when there's certain conditions, certain the right context, and there's like a mob mentality in terms of it becomes almost like a collective brain in a way, and the presence and the actions of the collective start influencing and impacting the behaviors and thoughts patterns of the individuals, or so they so it's said. Um, so those are some examples. I thought it was very interesting as well. There's a point where Trotsky says vulgar thought operates with such concepts as capitalism, morals, freedom, worker state, etc., as fixed abstractions, presuming that capitalism is equal to capitalism. Morals are equal to morals. Dialectical thinking analyzes all things and phenomena in their continuous change, while determining in the material conditions of those changes that critical limit beyond which A ceases to be A. And finally, I'll speak just a bit more on the tolerance. Let's see where he had that. Okay, right there. So every worker knows that it's impossible to make two completely equal objects. In the elaboration of bearing brass into cone bearings, a certain deviation is allowed for the cones, which should not, however, go beyond certain limits. This is called tolerance. By observing the norms of tolerance, the cones are considered as being equal. A equals to A. When tolerance is exceeded, the quantity goes over into quality. In other words, the cone bearings become inferior or completely worthless. Our scientific thinking is only a part of our general practice, including techniques. For concepts, there also exists tolerance, which is established not by formal logic issuing from the axiom A is equal to A, but by the dialectical logic assuming from the axiom that everything is always changing. Common sense is characterized by the fact that it systematically exceeds dialectical tolerance. I had to think about that for a second. I was like, what does that mean? Common sense is characterized by the fact that it systemically exceeds dialectical tolerance. But I think I understand what he's saying there because it makes sense this way. That dialecticians, because we should be on the lookout for that moment when a quantitative change, moves into a qualitative change, that we would have a lower tolerance threshold in terms of when we consider some, A to equal A, or whereas the common sense view, which, is more defined by, like I was saying earlier, discrete, delimited, independent items that are immutable and not interconnected or, dependent on these other things uh, that common sense because it's more interested in seeing the discrete lines between things. That's more interested in having A equal A and B equal B and keeping things like neatly like that. It has a far greater tolerance, so the tolerance exceeds the dialecticians. A way to conceptualize this that I was thinking of is anybody who's made stickers or buttons before in the propaganda committee. There's something called is it like the bleed line? I can't remember what it is, but it's essentially this, right? Like we make a design. Let's say it's a circle, and there's a circle line around the sticker where um and it's like not a line. What's the way to explain? So there are around it's a circular sticker, and then there's a portion where, the manufacturer says that's of the circle. It says, well, you want to stay within this circle because we can't guarantee that when we punch the hole for the sticker that it's going to be like exactly there. So actually we need more tolerance. We need you to like extend the bleed area to make it a bit of a bigger circular sticker than what you actually want because we might, cut it off accidentally. So I don't know that if that's a great example, but it did make sense in my head in terms of tolerance is that that leeway, that bit of extra conceptual leeway that you need to consider something will still remain something, even if in real life, like when we're actually making those stickers and the hole punch is holing out, we have to have like the tolerance, the design has to be larger so that when it comes out, we're not seeing a bunch of white on the edges. Where, to keep going with this example, if we saw a bunch of white on the edges, we should think maybe A isn't equal to A after all. Okay, so I'll just end that. What does this mean for us? I think there's actually like so many concrete um, applications because our orientation towards things and our participation of things should be based on our understanding of it, of the class character of it, the nature of the impact that it has on our society and reality, and, the impact that reality has had on the things that we're working on and, our orientation to things as well. Whether that's other organizations and other parties, or the NDP, for instance, we do orient given a certain interpretation and understanding of the class nature and class character of it. Um, but really, whether our society, are and analyzing our own political economy, analyzing the political economies of other states, um, all of this should be done with an understanding of this of the fact that things are constantly changing and that the world is dynamic and that the changes don't just change themselves, but they change other things and they engender, or could enact certain responses to those changes, and that everything affects other things, basically. So we do need to be on the lookout for when changes occur and not assume that everything is fixed and immutable. Okay, I'll leave it there. Questions, thoughts, comments? Oh, Gary, I think you're muted.
I'm not muted, but okay.
John, I see your hand.
Thanks. I'm always a little leery about using examples from the physical sciences in terms of Trotsky's dialectics, because he's talking about social forms and social evolution. While you were talking, it occurred to me that a good representation of the change of quantity change to quality is that the quote, first they ignore us, our quantity is too small. Then they laugh at us. We're big enough that they now have to pay attention to us, but they mock us. We grow a bit more and they fight us. So first they ignore us, then they laugh at us, then they fight us, and then we win. So in those four stages, there's three step changes of quality to quantity, from the success of the movement. So I offer that as a sideways thought.
Barry.
Yeah, thanks for the presentations. They're rather exciting, actually, for philosophy. I wasn't expecting. But Heraclitus is the philosopher to whom Marx looked because of his axiom and the underlying process there's nothing permanent but change. Now, to common sense denizens of the world, it seems like things just are pretty much the same all the time. The change takes forever, and it's not substantial. Things are pretty much fixed. But really, the opposite is true, only it becomes apparent only when the contradictions rise to such an extent that they are undeniable and overflowing the boundaries previously observed. So I remember an example that expresses this. What defines a revolution? And the answer typically by Marxists is when the rulers can no longer rule because the working class is no longer willing to be ruled. When do you reach that point? When the rulers can no longer rule because the oppressed and exploited are no longer willing to be ruled. Well, there's no mathematical formulation which tells you it's all about the relationship of forces, and they're always changing. That's why people, when, sometimes we say, well, you don't vote Democrat over the Republicans because they're much the same, and you don't join the Liberal Party to defeat Chrystia Freeland, which unfortunately the leftists just advocated today. Yves Engler, I was disappointed to see.
Yeah.
Because there's a fundamental difference between a workers' party and a outright bourgeois party, even if the workers' party is dominated by pro-capitalist leaders. Because at a certain point, the interest of the working class is undeniable. And if the party that purports to represent it won't satisfy that, then another one will. So there's constant change and constant breaking of barriers. That's the thing. When a pound of sugar is no longer a pound of sugar, I think encapsulates it in a good way. And we're always looking for the instances when quantity becomes quality. And that's when a revolution is about to take off in terms of the change in the relationship of forces that presents a doomed system with its terminus, and the new world beckons. Thanks.
Gary?
Okay, I'm going to make 3 points. One is Frederick Engels in the Dialectics of Nature, because Marx and Engels really emphasize that our dialectics comes straight out of nature and straight out of human society, which is simply an extension of nature. He set forward 3 basic laws of dialectical logic. One is the law of unity and conflict of opposites. That is, that within capitalism, as an example, you have unity of, in order for capitalism to work at all, there has to be a combination of capitalists and working class, running, both coming together in the factory to produce goods. Otherwise, we started there. Okay, so that's the unity of opposites, but the conflict of opposites is the fact that there are reconcilable differences of interest between the capitalists and the working class. And so you get the rise of wildcat strikes, the rise of unions, the rise of political parties, and ultimately the overthrow of capitalism in a mass movement in the streets, which is the conflict of opposites. Second law is the law of the passage of quantitative into qualitative changes, which we've been discussing. And the third one is the law of the negation of negation. So if the what that means is that the working class is a negation of capitalism, because, as I think somebody said, and Fred said more than once, that the capitalism requires brings into existence its own gravediggers, which is the working class. So the working class becomes a negation of capitalism, and the revolution negates that whole system of workers and capitalists and puts the workers in power. So those are 3 kind of fundamental laws of motion of dialectics. The third point I wanted to make is that the discussion that we had on China in our pre-convention discussion is a really good example, because when we were talking about, Barry and I do not disagree on that China is a reformed worker state. We both disagree with Jeff Mackler, where we were, he's gone too far. He's assumed that quantitative changes have turned into a qualitative change, and we both disagree. But what we were arguing was these particularities of and the dynamics of the Chinese revolution. What's going on? What direction is it headed? How fast is it headed? And what's the nature of the process that's going on in China? The whole discussion was on a very particular analysis of the dialectics of the Chinese Revolution. And we don't agree, but we use the same method. We're both considering the facts. We're trying to understand where the preponderance lies that determines what the direction, nature, and speed of change in China is. So that's a really good example where neither of us assume that it's going to stay the same. We both assume it's either going to get better or worse. And that's because we're both dialecticians. And so I think that is a really good example. Oh, one other point, since nobody's got their hand up. The permanence of Aristotelian logical categories works in the interest of the ruling class. In Middle Ages, for example, where you had the king, the nobility, the clergy, the merchant class, and the serfs, and they said, well, it's always going to be like this. This is the natural way for it to be. And then they also attribute permanence to the human nature. You can't organize it in any other way. Human nature is greedy, and human nature is competitive, and all these things, so that capitalism expresses the natural order of things and the way human beings are, and you can't change that. That's all bullshit. Human personality and human nature reflects the circumstances in which humans exist. If humans exist in circumstances which promote cooperation and social responsibility as opposed to individual right to exploit or to accumulate at the expense of our neighbors, then that will be the evolutionary nature of human personality. So we don't see, you can see the revolutionary implications of understanding that these things can change and will change and do change, opens up the door to understanding the dynamics of a progressive elimination of exploitation and oppression.
I just wanted to respond quickly, though. Go to Tom. I see your hand. Yeah, note on the what John is saying about the physical sciences and social sciences. I think, I have I don't know, it's a word, kind of more nuanced take on this, but Trotsky did point out even in that piece that they're not disconnected, right? And as Gary was just saying that, consciousness and human nature, is a product of material conditions and material reality. And I think, obviously that is true. But again, kind of keeping in mind emergence, it's a handy framework for me anyway, but I think it's basically the same as dialectics from everything that I'm hearing. It's just not called that. But, when you're recognizing how different components can interact and how their relationship can create a new kind of phenomenon or a new relationship. So, certain things like we're talking about water, right? Like that's on a certain level, that type of material science, I suppose it hasn't had as much of the synthesis, at least not that's observable to humans. So it's easier to agree on an objective, universal stance on that. When we get and so for that reason, I think there's a universal kind of tolerance, let's say. That's probably a better way to put it. There's like a universal level of tolerance for when we understand, when water is no longer water and it's back to being hydrogen and oxygen. Whereas the social sciences, by definition are more abstracted because we're looking at things, the things that we're analyzing are kind of synthesis of many other things already, right? It's like at, I don't want to say like higher level, but I guess higher level, but not like that indicates any kind of superiority or anything. It's just more complex. Um, and so I think on that side of things, like it's still connected, right? It's not like there's some disconnection from the material basis, but as we were talking about with synthesis and the sort of qualitative changes of things due to complexity, um, obviously, like as Trotsky said, the concepts are um, subject to this as well. But in those cases, the tolerance I think is not as universal. Like the common sense understanding of when a concept stops becoming a concept. A is going to equal A. Capitalism is going to equal capitalism. Human nature is going to equal human nature to a lot of people for a lot longer, um, on a common sense view than, water is going to equal water when the atoms are split apart. Do you know what I'm saying? So, um, I suppose that's how I see all of that fitting together. Okay, sorry about that. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking of biologist, his name came to me, Carl Sagan, who did some really interesting books back in the, I believe, the late 70s, early 80s. He was a biologist, he was a Marxist, but he didn't delve too much in politics. He talked mostly about evolutionary biology, but from a materialist perspective. And so if you get a chance to, if any of his stuff is out there, well worth looking at, because he talks a lot about this in biology, how plants and animals evolve, and it's not a continuous, gradual piece. I can't remember the term that's used for it, but
Are you talking about Jay Gould?
Stephen J.
Sagan was an
Gould.
astronomer.
Sorry, you're right, John.
Yeah, he
Stephen
was
J.
a
Gould.
cosmologist. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, same era, just the wrong name. Thank you. Stephen J. Gould, Gould. Yeah. We talked about change happens in interruptions. It gradually changes. No one notices, that the fish is growing some different appendage in the, whatever. And the day when the fish walks out onto the beach is quite an event. But in fact, the process of that happening was going on for potentially millennia. So it'll be the same, it's the same way you apply into a social world, I believe. So change is not gradual. Well, it's gradual, but when the quantitative turns to qualitative, it can appear extremely sudden. Like, where did this come from? Yeah, so I think it's really interesting, this short essay document, because particularly looking at the Russian Revolution, it seems even today leftists are very quick to look for a label for something. This is Bonapartist, this is worker state, this is capitalist. They're looking for a label, and of course there's some value in trying to define the class nature of a given political formation or a society. But I think we're a little quick to slap names on them. And I like that quote about not capitalism in general, but a given capitalism at a given stage of development. not a worker state in general, but a given worker state in a backward country in an imperious encirclement. And I think that's powerful guide for us, when we're looking at formations. So we have to, as materialists, we start from what's real. And if that leads to a name or some way that helps clarify what it is, fine, but the main thing is to observe, measure, analyze, describe, etc. Yeah, that's all I had to say.
Very well said, Tom. Yeah, Gary.
Well, I think that Tom's point is very good. I mean, we are as interested in making sure that we don't identify quantitative change as qualitative as we are at identifying when it does change to qualitative. Like the nature of the capitalist parties is capitalism. They defend the interests of the capitalist class and nothing else. The NDP is still, whatever, even if it gets into power, even if there's a few radicals, or you see the formation of a more or less successful iteration of the Socialist Caucus, it's still fundamentally a working class based party with a bourgeois program, and still serves essentially the same blocking interests in the interests where the leadership operates in the interests as labor lieutenants of the ruling class. On the physical side, the theory, Charles Darwin, with his theory of evolution, seriously brought dialectics or dialectical thinking into the physical sciences of evolution, of biology, both zoology and botany. And then, of course, the evolution of humans. We now know that we weren't suddenly born like being created in the Garden of Eden and so on. That we evolved over 3 million years from Australopithecus, Lucy, to the present time. Lucy was about 3.5 feet tall, and had a much smaller brain and was much more. Had much fewer tools to deal with, but we evolved over time to be much more capable of defending ourselves. And now, of course, we dominate the world, much to the detriment of the world, because the nature of the social organization under which we operates for profit and not the interests of humanity and the world in which it lives. But yeah, I mean, Linnaeus was a biologist before Darwin, and he was a botanist. He classified all kinds of plants, trees, and all the flora of the earth. But all he could do was describe things, because he didn't understand anything about the evolution of things. He didn't understand where they were coming from, or understand really the nature of the relationship between things. Once evolutionary botanists started to look at it, they say, well, really, this is related to that, because actually this evolved out of that, and so this is part of the same family of plants and so on. You could only see it from that perspective, which was related to what. And so it became much more dynamic, much more understandable by seeing it as a moving picture. Not that Linnaeus was a brilliant man; he did not have the dialectical method, and it was an incorrigible flaw for him in terms of his classification, that he didn't have the understanding of change.
I just see something in the chat. Okay, Helen says, I'm also leery about trying to graft scientific ideas onto social theory, especially when so few of us have a proper grasp on the scientific principles that underpin those ideas. We need to be careful about making these analogies to buttress social theory, remembering our other misapplications of science like eugenics and phrenology. I found the article annoying from that point of view. Also was irritated by the critique of symbolic logic. It seemed like a straw man argument. Symbolic logic has its uses, and calling it vulgar does not advance Trotsky's own argument. Thanks, Flo, for acknowledging that the examples are not the best. Her discussion is more interesting than the article. Okay, well, thank you. That's funny. I love this article, but maybe because it just it reminded me of a lot of things that I've studied before, so it was making a lot of connections in my brain. I mean, I'm sure that Gary has thoughts on that. Anyone else as well? I have a thought. I have a thought I'll just add there. Um, Kind of jumping off what people were talking about. Tom, I agree. I really, really like that sentence where it was like not a general capitalism, but this a specific capitalism in context. And that he also in that text recognized that Linnaeus um was a genius, right? But he said, in fairness to Linnaeus, he was born before, he lived before Marx or Darwin. So having, or no, was it? Oh yeah, he did mention that about Linnaeus, but also, who was it that he said had anticipated the general movement of science? Maybe that was Linnaeus, but because he was anticipating it and hadn't actually lived and gone through and experienced it, because of that, his analysis or trajectory was more idealist, right? Which I think makes sense because, and I think that we can even apply that, and I'm going to get into some dangerous territory here, but to, our Marxist, original Marxists themselves, the classical Marxists themselves. Because, Helen, I take your point a lot about the, our kind of misapplications of science, right? And when being somebody that studied religion and science and philosophy as kind of like epistemic systems, there's a lot when I think about Trotsky and Lenin and Marx in their historical context, when science was just really picking up speed, honestly, like a lot of the time, the late 20th century or late 19th century. And since then, I think there's been a lot of critical analysis of science as a field of study in itself. And I do think that some of the classical Marxists and other people just in general tend to can reify sort of science or the scientific method, or basically they have an idealist kind of conception of science that doesn't actually take into account the dialectical nature of science and scientific knowledge itself. And I think that we have made progress on that as a sort of society on our scholarship. And I believe that if, Trotsky and Lenin were alive today, they would incorporate that knowledge into their analysis of science, and they wouldn't just hang on to their understanding of science as something that is so uniformly applicable and constant and fixed in a way, right? So I think they would do that. I see your hand, John.
I was just listening so hard, I forgot I was going to say. One of the things I would also was going to comment on is it's easy to get trapped in the process of analysis and the effectiveness and the correctness of the analysis and slide over into teleological arguments, right? At the end of the day, we have to remember this is still a struggle. It still has to be won. It's there just because our analysis is correct doesn't mean we're going to win. So that's I think the key lesson here: learning these modes of analysis, applying them to real world struggles. I mean, what have we learned from the failures of 20th century socialism? What is research like in the 20th century? Those old guys like me, we all learned, there were hunter-gatherer societies, then there was agriculture, and then it was a very step change. And there's been a lot of new books, a lot of research the last 10 or 20 years that says that's just bullshit. That human societies were much more complicated. There are Central American societies that were hunter-gatherer sometimes a year, then they gathered in cities, and they had sheriffs and laws, and they were anarchistic when they're. So we have to keep learning from those things to apply what we have, because we know the capitalists are learning too.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Gary.
There's always a tendency to slide back towards Aristotelian thinking, to see science, see how the study of science goes through certain steps, so the human society goes through certain steps, and that's fixed. So you see that there's change, and then you start to formalize the change rather than seeing that it had similarities and differences in different parts of the world. And yeah, so I think the other thing about science is that science is there are a lot of people, scientists, who have good motives, but they're conflicted in their interests. They're trying to get grants from bourgeois foundations and all that kind of stuff. And in order to do that, they have to do what the foundations are interested in. And that may not be what they're interested in. It may not be the best way to advance science, but it's a way to get grants. And so you see all sorts of contradictions within science of a very material nature. And that buggers up science a lot. There is a German cosmologist, physicist, and her field of study was quantum mechanics. And she's called Sabina, and I forget her last name, but she has a podcast almost every day, and she deals with the conflicts within science and how string theory, which she now thinks is complete nonsense, is people are still doing it, and they're doing all kinds of research because they can get money for that. And even though it's becoming more and more understood that this is useless stuff, they do it, and a whole new generation will continue to try to do it through their careers because that's what they're trained in and that's what they can get money for. So she talks about this kind of pressure on science, that science can be warped and abused by the effects of capitalism or any class society that is looking for profit.
Absolutely. Any other closing comments or questions? I guess we're at 6:30, so we can think of wrapping it up. I have one more kind of point to just touch on briefly, see if people have thoughts on this, but just the tension or dichotomy then between, because clearly, yes, things are in constant change. Nothing is permanently fixed. I mean, that's just kind of obvious in our experiential reality. But on the other hand, I mean, as we've been saying, a lot of things also seem to remain the same. I mean, certainly certainly class relations, the fundamental dynamic of like capital exploitation has remained the same since, the sort of degradation of feudalism. And even across different epochs of production, there has also been a kind of consistent dynamic between a powerful class that's able to accumulate more resources and power, and use that to exploit and oppress less powerful. So, we've seen that. So how can we kind of hold those two things together as well as dialecticians? And to me, the way I tend to see it is, if dialectical materialism is this kind of philosophy that requires us to examine things not in the abstract, not as a snapshot, but in real time as it moves through time and space. That applied to history, that's basically historical dialectics. And Marx, when he looked at history and was trying to figure out why our kind of economy, or at that point, I mean, it was why the distribution of goods and services are as it is. Why is the society set up the way it is? Why do examining the material reality, the wealth of society and the different distributions there. Marx and Trotsky mentions this at one point in the piece too, but Marx was using class as I guess using class as the lens, but it's more like when you take a dialectical approach to analyzing history, class is the inevitable outcome. Like class is like the result. It's just the name that Marx gave to the to explain the modern phenomenon of the exploiting group, which because of the dynamics of capitalism based on wage labor and mobility of wage labor and employment was a new kind of phenomenal exploitation, not exactly the same as feudalism, but really only a sidestep removed. But we can't say that A is equal to A and that capitalism is equal to feudalism, right? They're different, but they're not so qualitatively different to not be connected by exploitation and class in a sense, right? So I don't know if I'm making sense there, but I would love to hear other people's thoughts on kind of like the fact that there is consistency in class dynamics or in power dynamics over time, with the fact that everything is changing constantly. So again, to me, I kind of go back to that like functional analysis of something. We haven't had a socialist revolution, so obviously like capital class exploitation is going to be with us until we do. But it might look different than it has before, right? And that's kind of where the changes come in and where we should be able to assess, things along a functional line of when the working class is getting oppressed or exploited, rather than just assume that capitalism is going to equal capitalism, that it's going to remain fixed and it won't have different kind of characteristics, even if the fundamental dynamic is the same. So it's kind of hard to parse, but that's what I think about on those lines. Any thoughts on that? Gary?
Well, not quite on that, but one of the things that sociologists and economists do is they befuddle the whole term class. They talk about income classes and all that stuff. They talk about people who earn less than $70,000 a year, people who earn more than $150,000 a year, and they're muddling out people who are skilled workers, people who are petty bourgeois professionals, and so on and so forth. And they just destroy or attempt to destroy or remove from our minds the real issue of class to a Marxist is the relationship to the means of production. Workers have nothing to sell but their labor. That's the working class, and a petty bourgeois professional has an education. I mean, they don't have ownership of substantial means of production, except when they get combined in massive accounting firms and massive law firms. Then they do have a lot of wealth, and they are related directly to the doings of the capitalist class. They help organize it, and they themselves have a lot of physical property. But this whole question of defining class by its relationship to the means of production, we have to fight to defend that all the time. So that has remained. The nature, the composition of the working class has changed. There's more of a white collar working class now. There's more of a skilled working class, more knowledge workers. But their fundamental thing is all they've got to sell is their labor power. That's what we need to stick to. And it's a question of quantity change, but the quality hasn't changed. A worker is a worker is a worker. because they have nothing left to sell but their own power, their own labor power. So that helps cut through the bullshit of capitalist sociology and capitalist economics, and helps keep us on the right path.
Definitely. Well, folks, are we about ready to wrap this up?
Just say a little prayer and then off we go.
Oh. Okay, well, that was really fun. Thanks everyone for the discussion.
Philosophy
I know, who knew? Could be such a good time, right?
comes from philosophy, to love wisdom.
Oh, love that. Hi, Helen.
Hi. I'm about to call it quits at work here. So
Okay.
Okay.
Well,
Bye-bye,
thanks for
everyone.
joining in. Okay, good night, everyone, and see you next time.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
bye. Bye.